Well, good morning, committee members and members of the public who are joining us for this meeting. Before I discuss the agenda, I would like to call the meeting to order. And I would like to go over a few virtual meeting points. Please mute your line when you're not speaking. Please introduce yourself or announce yourself if you're asking a question or speaking. And please remember that this meeting is being recorded and it may be possible for the public and/or the members to see you. If you are using the video link, you may turn the camera off if you need to step away for a minute. Now I'd like to ask April to call the roll.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Senator Saslaw. I'll come back. I saw him earlier. Senator Normant.
Here.
Senator Hanger.
Here.
Senator Lucas.
Here.
Senator Newman.
Here.
Senator Ruff.
Here.
Senator Vogel.
Here.
Senator Barker. Senator Edwards. See Senator Edwards.
Here.
Senator Deeds.
Here.
Senator Locke.
Here.
Senator Peterson. Senator Marsden.
Here.
Senator Eben.
Here.
Senator McClellan.
Here.
And I'll go back. Senator Saslaw.
Here.
Madam Chair, you have a quorum.
Thank you. Well, now turning to our agenda, we're getting an early start this year in an effort to move efficiently through the 2021 session. Today, this first meeting includes an update on national and Virginia economic conditions from Renee Halton, Vice President and Regional Director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And this will be followed by a presentation on the governor's introduced budget by our committee staff. So now I'll turn it over to you, Renee Halton. Thank you for being here and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all having me here. Please bear with me for just one moment as I share my screen. And if someone could confirm when you're able to see that.
We can see it.
We see it.
Wonderful. Okay, great. Well, thank you again so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and share what we're seeing at the Federal Reserve. Just a moment of background, my role at the Richmond Fed is primarily to do outreach with our businesses and communities in our district that we serve. And in particular, I study Virginia. And so I spend a lot of my days on the ground talking with businesses saying, how are you feeling the economy? How are you experiencing the economy? And this helps complement a lot of the hard data that we look at the Fed. So I'll be incorporating a bit of both in my comments today. So what I'm going to do is review just a little bit of where we've been, talk about Virginia, and then end on this note of what I'm expecting in 2021, what I'm looking for. And the upshot of what I'm going to share today is really here on this slide. I'll emphasize that this recession is not like previous ones. So we should expect the recovery to behave a little bit differently. It's different in a couple of respects. First, the scale of things that we've seen is truly incredible in terms of the severity of the declines that we experienced. And second, the nature of this recession is very different. We're not working through a major imbalance like a housing bubble or financial market weakness or a dot-com boom like in our previous recessions in recent history. Rather, we just sort of turned the lights off to limit the virus, sent everyone home, cut off their ability to produce and consume. And so what that means is to some extent, we can resume normal activity when the virus dissipates. However, the longer this goes on, the more you can imagine fundamental relationships in the economy breaking and maybe some things having to be rethought. And so because of this, we can expect, I think, the second half of the recovery to be slower than the first has been. The first has been pretty rapid. And it's really going to be about bridging businesses and households through to the other side, as well as figuring out which sectors need to be permanently downsized or reimagined. And that process will leave behind some pains for people that have been affected. And sadly, this is a real hallmark of this recession. It's recessions do tend to be unequal, but that has been especially true in the COVID recession. Some people have been affected significantly more than others. A huge chunk of the economy has hardly been affected at all, namely sectors where you could just easily shift to a work from home posture, while it has disproportionately affected lower income, people of color, women, people with less wealth. In many cases, people already strapped. And so that's a real hallmark. Inequality is a real hallmark of this crisis. So that's sort of the upshot of what I'm going to cover today. And now I'll dig into some of the data. I always start with GDP. This is our broadest measure of economic activity. And this just shows you the scale of what we've experienced. GDP fell 5% in the first quarter, which is remarkable because COVID was really only the last couple weeks of that quarter. And then GDP fell an even more remarkable 31.4% in the second quarter. And keep in mind that due to how the data are reported in the United States, this is an annual rate. So it's not as if we lost a third of the economy in the second quarter. You can essentially divide that by 4. So rather, we lost somewhere around 8% of our economy in the second quarter, but that's still utterly extraordinary. You can see the scale of that on this chart. We gained 33.1% in the third quarter, but that's not enough to make up for what we've lost. So that's another key theme, is that we've recovered fast, but not enough to make up for what we've lost. I'd like to focus your attention on the right-hand side of the chart, those dots and bars, and that shows the forecast of Fed policymakers. This comes out 4 times a year. It's public. It's on the Board of Governors website, and most recently came out just in mid-December. And so there's a few things to point out about these forecasts. One, as of December, the Fed policymakers expect GDP to be down 2.4% for 2020 when all's said and done. So that's pretty remarkable given where we've been. For 2021, the median forecast is GDP growth of 4.2%, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that. That's a pretty high numbers in terms of GDP growth. Trend growth is usually around 2%, but that large number reflects making up for some of what we've lost. And if you see that bar, the forecast bar for 2021, it's pretty tall. And that reflects, that's a wide band of uncertainty around that forecast. There's a lot of upside and downside risk here, as you all are aware of in this uncertain environment. And then the Fed policymakers are expecting us to get back to trend growth, which is around 1.8% in the longer run. So that's the first point, just the numbers about what Fed policymakers are expecting. The second point is that the economy has bounced back much faster than expected. Our September forecast had GDP down 3.7% for 2020, and even that was a big improvement from earlier the year. And June, we had it down to 6.5% in 2020. So what you're seeing is a GDP recovery that's continued to be stronger than expected, once again demonstrating the resilience of the U.S. economy. And then finally, there is a lot of uncertainty around that 2021 forecast. That said, a lot of the uncertainty, some of it has resolved even since these numbers came out, namely in terms of the new stimulus package that's been passed. So that was a key thing that Fed policymakers said will kind of shape the outlook for 2021. And now we've got some greater clarity on that, as well as continued news about the vaccine, which I'll come back to in a bit. And FOMC members are expecting the first quarter of 2021 to be somewhat lower with the surge in virus cases, with then a pickup in growth for the remainder of the year. So that was GDP and growth rates, and I'm showing you GDP in levels. When you've had swings as big as we've had, the level tells you a bit more. And you can just see here the enormous drop and then the sharp bounce back that we've experienced, but still about a third of the economy left to recover from what we've lost. And then it's helpful to look at what categories of GDP declined the most, because then you can understand where to look for recovery. At the Fed, we always focus on consumer spending because it's about 70% of economic activity. And in the COVID recession, it was 78% of the decline. And this was really a story of sending people home and limiting their ability to spend. As you all know, spending on services, especially those in-person high-touch services, is what declined the most. This chart shows both categories of consumer spending, goods and services, which again, together are about 2/3 of the total economy. And here I'm switching to monthly data. And what you can see is that spending on services, which is that light blue line, fell by 20% in March and April, and it's still down 6% relative to pre-COVID, and this is as of November. While spending on goods, which is the dark blue line, fell by 15% in March and April, and it's now up 7%. And if you look at spending on durable goods, which is a component of goods, it's up 13%. So in other words, to some extent, people switched their consumption from services to goods. However, there are only so many couches and chainsaws that you can buy. And so overall spending is still quite a bit depressed from where we were pre-COVID. And I would suggest to you that spending on services, again, that light blue line, is going to be a key thing to watch as an indicator of our return to normalcy. When that light blue line starts to recover, it's going to be a sign that normalcy is returning, but clearly we are not there yet. And so what determines when the consumer will come back? Well, obviously, one key factor is the virus itself. When will people feel comfortable engaging in commerce again? Perhaps especially those in-person services. But another important component of consumer spending is the outlook for jobs, and that's what this chart shows. This shows job growth or loss in levels, and you can see the enormous drop that we've experienced in COVID. In April, we lost 20.1 million jobs on net, or a 13.5% decline in 1 month. I know you're all aware of this. And we've added jobs back faster than anyone was expecting. Again, we lost 22 million jobs total in COVID and have gained back about 12 million. So we've recovered just over half of our COVID job losses, but still 9.8 million jobs left to recover. And as a reminder, a good jobs report before COVID would have added about 200,000 jobs a month. So these are just enormous swings. And the thing to watch here is those last gains. When do we get back up to that trend line we were on? What level of employment do we recover to, and how long does it take for us to get there? And you really can't answer that question without looking sector by sector, and I'll come back to that in a bit. As we know, certain sectors, namely the high touch sectors like leisure and hospitality, were hit a lot harder. And no one knows for sure what permanent changes or damages COVID will bring, but it's not hard to imagine that some of those sectors may not ever come back to what they were before. And again, I'll come back to the sectors in a moment. And there are two forecasts about job growth that I give you. However fast the economy recovers, and I just gave you the Fed's forecast a couple of slides ago, I'd expect spending to recover faster than jobs. We've got about a third of GDP left to regain from what we lost in COVID, but half of jobs. And partly that's because firms are being conservative. They're investing in automation. They're learning to make do with less. They're just being conservative in hiring right now. The second forecast I'd give you is I would expect the second half, again, of the recovery to be slower than the first. A lot of the gains we experienced between May and the fall were about turning the lights off and on again. And there was some low-hanging fruit, some amount of which we could just send people back to normal production and consumption. The rest of the gains are going to be a little bit more about what sectors permanently change as a result of COVID and what level they recover to. And again, as a society, our work is going to be helping households and businesses bridge to the other side, whatever that other side looks like. And the fact that we are still a ways to go from an employment recovery especially matters because, again, this was a deep recession with huge job losses. So this is a really interesting picture. It compares the COVID recession to previous recessions. You can see the COVID recession is that purple line over on the left. And it's got that very sharp V shape so far. So though we've had record monthly job gains in a lot of 2020, we're only now at the trough of the Great Recession, which, remember, at the time was the deepest recession since the Great Depression. So just to scale things a bit. And you can also see the leveling off of the recovery since September or so in that purple line sort of flattening out. If there's good news, it's that most forecasters don't expect the recovery to be quite as slow as these jobless recoveries were. Each of these, again, featured some kind of major imbalance to work through, and that's less so the case in COVID. Again, even though some sectors will almost certainly need to be rethunk. The Fed policymakers expect that by the end of 2023, which is less than 3 years from now, the unemployment rate will be more or less recovered at 4%. Following the financial crisis, by contrast, it took more than 8 years for employment to recover that much. So a bit of a faster recovery here because of the different nature of this recession is what's expected. Overall, this switches to the unemployment rate. The overall unemployment rate is that green line on the bottom, and it was unchanged in December at 6.7%, which is down from a peak of 15%, so quite high. And the declines, the recovery in unemployment can be misleading. It is partly due to people dropping out of the labor force, which means they're no longer counted in the unemployment rate. And if you were to take all those people that had dropped out of the labor force and counted them as unemployed, the unemployment rate would be closer to 9 or 10%. Okay, so the green line is total unemployment, and that still represents 10.7 million people looking for work and not finding it, or almost 5 million more than we had in February. But despite this elevated unemployment, another unusual aspect of COVID is that it's pretty well known that some firms are having significant trouble finding workers in lots of sectors, such as tech, nursing, skilled trades, even some manufacturing. So it's an unusually chunky labor market, again, where hiring is going fine in some places, but people are still really hurt in others. And so I do want to talk a moment about disparities, because again, that's a major hallmark of this crisis. Some groups have been disproportionately hurt, and that's partly about the sectors where they tend to work, and also about differences in education level. So you see the light blue line is the unemployment rate for Blacks, and that is systematically higher, but it spiked more in COVID than the overall unemployment rate. Fortunately, that gap has closed somewhat more toward historical levels, but the gap itself is still worrisome. The unemployment rate for Blacks in December was 9.9%, almost 4 percentage points higher than the 6% rate for whites. And the same is true for the young, and although I'm not showing it here, the less educated, so particularly people without a high school degree. Young people tend to work in those high touch sectors that were significantly hurt. And why we think that matters is that if you enter, if you experience a recession earlier in your career, it can be the case that you experience lower income for sort of the rest of your career as well. So for these people, affected in this way, retraining, getting people re-engaged in the labor force is going to be a key thing to focus on. I mentioned labor force participation, and this is going to be something to watch as we recover. Labor force participation has been creeping up in recent years, despite baby boomers retiring, but in COVID, it dropped dramatically. You can see those on the far right-hand side of the screen. Now, that always happens in downturns as some people become discouraged and leave the labor force, but this is a very dramatic drop. Another factor is undoubtedly the virus itself, right? Some people just don't feel comfortable working now. Another important factor is dependent care, child care centers having been closed, schools remote. There's been a lot of news stories about this and how it's particularly affected women. Since the 1970s, women have been a large part of gains in labor force participation, but now that's shifted. There are now 2.1 million fewer women in the labor force than before the pandemic, compared to 1.7 million fewer men. And so why does this matter? We care about labor force participation in terms of our ability to grow. And the number of workers we have in the economy is an indicator of our ability to grow. It's a component of our ability to grow as an economy. And as I mentioned, we're already hearing stories about businesses struggling to open or recover as much as they'd like because they can't find the workers, which I know sounds very counterintuitive with the high unemployment rates we've experienced. So there's some degree of mismatch between the workers that we have and the workers that businesses are looking for. Mismatch in terms of skill, but also in terms of geography, as well as some factors like childcare, just keeping people out of the labor force. So this is going to be a key thing to watch going forward. And for workers in the hardest hit sectors, many were lower wage to begin with. And that's another very troubling part of this crisis. Mm-hmm. So this chart represents about 25% of employment pre-COVID. And these are shares of employment and wages for each of these sectors, again, before COVID. The dark blue line is the share of employment that each sector had, and the light blue line is the share of wages. So for all these sectors, the light blue line is shorter than the dark blue line, and that means that these sectors had disproportionately low wages. And so what I'm pointing out here is we know these are many of the hardest hit sectors, tended to also be lower wage sectors. And again, that's also tends to disproportionately employ women, people of color, younger people, and people with less education. So it's just another way of showing that the disparities of this crisis are going to be a key thing to watch going forward. Now, in terms of the fiscal stimulus package that was passed, I already talked about the importance of the consumer and the importance of the labor market to the consumer. Another highly unusual aspect of the COVID recession was that consumers actually had more money in their pockets on average, not less. And the reason for that is twofold. Income really spiked in this recession due to fiscal stimulus, just as there were fewer places to spend that money, plus some precautionary savings given the uncertain environment. And households used these added funds to shore up savings and pay down debt. And now, that was helpful in terms of helping prepare them to buffer from the shock to some extent. Now, of course, we have a new fiscal stimulus package in place, and that's a key thing that's shifted, I believe, since you had your last economic briefing. That includes some expanded unemployment benefits, though not as generous as last time, and new rounds of stimulus checks. So I would expect this to help backstop the consumer in the coming months, which could be sorely needed as cases surge and as we get through the winter, and perhaps any spending retrenchment that follows the holiday season. And so a key question is going to be when consumers come back to the table and when this money starts filtering into the economy. The stimulus payments should help, but then there's still this question of how the most hurt households will get through to the other side. So that's a key thing that we'll be watching. Just quickly, I just want to touch on the manufacturing sector. It's been an interesting story in that sector. It was significantly hurt, as you can see in the light blue line, that significant drop, though not as much as the services sector. And by the way, this is surveys from the Richmond Fed. That's where these data come from. But manufacturing has experienced a very significant rebound. We're now doing much better in manufacturing by this measure than we were previous to COVID. Manufacturing is responsible for about 8 or 9% of total employment and fell by 10% in COVID. But again, it's surged quite a bit. And the interesting thing about manufacturing, why I think it was worth pointing out now, is that inventories generally are pretty low, and that portends positive growth in manufacturing going forward to rebuild those inventories that were hurt from COVID related effects in 2020. So this should provide a bit of continued strength in 2021. I want to, before I jump into talking about Virginia, I just want to mention interest rates. One thing helping consumer durables and manufacturing is that the Fed rates have been at rock bottom, and that's poised to continue. So this shows FOMC members' forecast for interest rates for each year going forward. Each dot is one individual Fed policymaker, all anonymous. I don't know which one of these dots is the president of the Richmond Fed, for example. But what you can see here is only one Fed policymaker sees any chance of rates rising before 2023. And only 5 of them see them rising in 2023. And so this means that Fed policy will continue to be stimulative to interest sensitive sectors like housing, autos, and other consumer durables. So quickly touching on Virginia. I want to spend a little time talking about how Virginia's employment situation compares to the United States. Virginia employers added just 8,000 jobs in November. And while that is in line with the percent of jobs added to the United States, it's a little bit slower than it has been. In general, the recovery has slowed somewhat since September or so. Virginia lost a smaller share of jobs in COVID. We lost about 10.7% of our jobs. That's 438,000 jobs, so just under 500,000, compared to 14.5% for the United States. And this is largely due to Virginia being less concentrated in those hard-hit sectors like leisure and hospitality. The US and Virginia alike have experienced similar recoveries. We've each regained about 56% of what was lost. But put differently, employment in Virginia is down 4.4% relative to a year ago, which is better than the nation as a whole. Overall, again, this is a recovery that's slowed somewhat since September or so. Overall, Virginia does track the nation very well. I mean, in fact, after years of slower job growth than the nation, we have fared better. Just quickly touching upon the unemployment rate in Virginia, similar story, our unemployment rate didn't spike as high and now is a good bit lower than the United States. And our unemployment rate is routinely lower in Virginia. I think a big part of that is probably our highly educated workforce. But this does reflect 264,000 unemployed Virginians, about twice as many as pre-COVID levels. On the one hand, this reduction in unemployment is welcome. We're well below the national unemployment rate. But on the other hand, there are a lot of Virginians who left the labor force, same story as the United States as a whole. And that means they're not counted in that overall unemployment rate. So we have 176,000 fewer Virginians in the labor force today compared to before the pandemic. And if you added those two, you counted those as unemployed, we get an unemployment rate of around 8.6%. So again, sort of the real numbers a bit higher due to all those people leaving the labor force. And so what accounts for the differences between Virginia and the United States? It helps to look at to where our jobs are concentrated. A key takeaway is that Virginia looks a lot like the United States in terms of our industrial composition, and that's good for us. It means we have a diverse economy. And this chart can tell you two things. One is what industries are most important to Virginia. We're always going to be vulnerable to trade, transportation, and utilities, which includes retail, professional and business services, as well as government and education and health. For example. The second thing you can get from this chart is how we differ from the United States. And that's where there's a big difference in the length of our bars. So for Virginia, the professional and business services sector is the most important, plus government and other services. But we are less dependent on manufacturing and education. So why Virginia might be faring better, a couple of ideas is our reliance on government and professional and business services. A lot of those are jobs that can be done remotely. That may have helped us. The government also tends to buffer in recessions, and that has certainly been true for the federal government this time around. And we're less reliant on those hard-hit sectors like leisure and hospitality and trade, transportation, and utilities. So that accounts for, I think, some of our better performance in Virginia. And so then what this chart looks at is how each of those sectors has grown or shrank, as it were, in COVID. So I like to, this is employment relative to a year ago, just gives you a snapshot of sort of where we are and how much we've got left to recover, if you will. Across the board, we've recovered about 56% of jobs in COVID. There's a couple of other takeaways from this chart. One is that the job gains and losses across sectors have been highly uneven. You can see leisure and hospitality on one far end of the spectrum and construction on the other end. In fact, construction is the only sector in Virginia that's growing. Not surprisingly, high touch sectors lead the losses. Leisure and hospitality lost half of its workers in March and April, and it's gained a lot back, but it's still down quite a bit. So a lot of recovery left to go. That said, leisure and hospitality is only 9% of employment in Virginia. A second thing that I'd point out from this slide is that employment is down across the board. And so a key question, if you sort of take out leisure and hospitality, that really hard hit sector, a key question for each of those sectors is what level do they recover to? It seems to me, if you take out, again, leisure and hospitality, they're down across the board about in that 2 to 7% range, again, with the sole exception being construction. Overall, for a lot of businesses, you're seeing a right sizing going on. The mentality of a lot of businesses that I talk to is never waste a crisis, doing things like cost cutting measures to survive. Also saying, maybe we can get by being 5% smaller permanently. Even if our production is the same, maybe we've learned how to do with fewer employees. So you're seeing businesses sort of go through this process and figure out what their proper size is going forward. But really, you have to drill down sector by sector to really look at a forecast, and each sector has got their own sort of unique story going on. In construction, one of the stories is that housing, and in Northern Virginia are, of course, leading the way in Virginia. The housing market's going strong. Commercial real estate's more of a mixed bag, right? You've got segments like industrials and multifamily that are doing very well. And you've got other segments like office space that are more of a question. So you just really have to dig down sector by sector to get that clear picture of where employment's going in Virginia and in the nation as a whole. And I just want to note that I talked a lot about disparities by demographics, disparities by sector, and there are also disparities by geography. So this shows the share of COVID job losses that have been recovered by regions in Virginia. And it goes from just 25% of jobs recovered to almost all. So it varies quite a bit. How much you were hurt depends on, I think, two factors. One is your incidence of the virus in the region where you are, and second is the sectors that you depend on. And it's not always a straightforward story. For example, on Hampton Roads, it's heavily dependent on leisure and hospitality. However, it's a drive-to market. And so it's actually done pretty well relative to leisure and hospitality in the rest of the country. So there are really unique stories going on in different places. You've seen in the Roanoke region, there's a lot of exposure to schools and to universities, for example. Rural areas tended to not have as many virus cases, but many were less diversified and already struggling before COVID. So there are really unique, interesting stories to tell by region that I wish we had more time to get into today. And then finally, I'm coming at the end here, looking to what I'm expecting in 2021. First, the recent surge in cases is absolutely hurting the economy. We can see it. One of the coolest innovations in the economics community since COVID has been embracing high frequency data, really unique data sources, because the big data have really been lagging the virus itself. So we've been looking at things like daily credit card spending, small business hours that they're open, the mobility of individuals based on cell phone records. And you do see a bit of a flattening of the recovery in the last couple of months with the big surge that we've had. But second, we now have 3 vaccines here or on the way, and that created some lent more certainty for better and for worse in the economy. So for better, the recovery is coming, and there is a lot of strength to help us get through to the other side in terms of stimulus spending, for example. But on the worst side, it seems that the recovery is going to be some time away, and it won't be even. The vaccine is going to take some time to roll out. Probably no business that I'm talking to is expecting it to really hit on a wide scale until the second half of the year. And that's really started to hit around November of last year. Businesses started to look forward and said, I'm happy the vaccine is coming. I feel better because of it, but it's a bit of a ways off. So that tends to be the sentiment out there, as well as for most economic forecasters. One person I talked to in health said he is optimistic about spending Thanksgiving with his family. So with hope it'll be sooner than that, but we'll see. I think it's possible that the second quarter of this year is going to start to feel pretty good. For many people, this past summer felt like a bit of a reprieve, with better weather enabling some limited social activities and restaurant going. And this spring could start to feel like that. And you also may start to see the vaccine starting to hit in infection numbers in small ways. So a key question is going to be how we bridge to that other side. For businesses, how do you stay alive for the next 6 to 9 months? How do you plan? And for the most hard-hit households, how much do the stimulus payments help buffer you from shocks? And again, the recovery won't be felt equally, which is something I've talked about quite a bit, and something that is going to be key to watch those particularly hit individuals and businesses in geographies, what becomes of them. So with that, I'll pause, and if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take some.
Thank you, Renee. You've given us a real lay of the land, both in Virginia and nationally. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, Madam Chair, it's Adam Eben.
Senator Eben.
I noticed you have jobs down in, I think, all areas of construction, but I was surprised to see jobs down in government. I was just wondering if there's any there.
Yeah, it's a mix in government. Government, of course, includes federal and state and local. Federal government jobs have been up, but state and local are what have been down. So that's sort of the difference there, kind of canceling out. Of course, we're all looking to see what happens with state and local government finances as a result of everything we've experienced. And I think the sentiment is there's going to be some amount of delayed effect there. You all would probably know that better than me, but you do have the federal government sort of providing a positive
Thank you.
boost there.
Is there another question?
Madam Chairman, Tom has a question.
Senator Norman.
Renee, does it cause concern or at least a pause at the prospects of another exorbitant increase in the national debt and how to address it
Sure, that's a really important question. And of course, I usually expect to get that question in almost every talk that I give because it's a big concern. There are a couple things that I'd say. One is that the sentiment among economists is that a sort of massive shock like we've experienced is the reason you have government. The government can sort of provide a degree of insurance that private markets really couldn't when there's a shock this widespread. So most economists are of the sentiment that the stimulus spending that we've done is very much appropriate for given the type of shock that we've experienced. That said, the federal debt is one of my favorite research topics, and it is the case that it has to be righted sooner or later. And the key factor there is when financial markets expect the government debt to no longer be sustainable. And at that point, and when you see financial markets stop pulling back lending to the federal government, that's what we call a financial crisis. And how that manifests, what that looks like, is a massive spike in interest rates, right? That creates all sorts of other problems. The trouble is that economic research, even history, gives us absolutely no guidance as to when financial market expectations will shift. It can happen overnight. But evidently, financial markets have believed our government debt or deficit to be somewhat sustainable, at least for now. But again, with the caution that that can shift very suddenly. So it is a key thing to watch. Every economist says, even though if they support the stimulus spending that we've done, the federal debt has got to be the next medium-term thing to worry about. And sooner rather than later, there needs to be not a retrenchment in spending now necessarily, given the shock that we're in, but a plan very soon for that. So it absolutely is a key concern for the economy, and it would cause very large problems and disruptions if that sort of financial crisis started to emerge.
Thank you. Is there any other question?
I think the senator's on mute.
Renee, thank you. It does cause me to pause when you say that the national debt is one of your favorite subjects to research. You need to get a life.
I wouldn't disagree with you.
Okay, is there any other question? Well, thank you, Renee. You've really given us a lot of information that will be very valuable as we go forward and try and wrestle with our budget over the next few weeks. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now I'm going to turn this over to April to start off our staff presentations. And I'm going to ask staff to pause at the end of each segment so that you can ask any questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Are you able to see the screen that I'm sharing?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, Madam Chair, we're going to quickly try to go through this presentation this morning in the interest of time, but I also want to note that each of your subcommittees will be doing a more in-depth presentation either in their first or second meeting. So even though we will pause for questions today, if there are more questions, members will have another opportunity. Moving quickly through, just if you think back about the revenue outlook, the introduced budget that the governor sent down in December assumes about $1.3 billion in additional general fund resources over the budget that you passed in November during the 2020 special session 1. Those increases mainly come from revisions to corporate sales and use and recordation taxes, and the revenues that are assumed to grow by 1.2% in the first fiscal year and 3.3% in the second fiscal year. The introduced budget does assume partial conformity with the CARES Act, which results in general fund revenue reduction of about $42 million over the biennium. It does not, however, account for additional tax provisions in the recently enacted COVID-19 relief bill. So that will be a topic that the committee will discuss further. It does assume passage of legislation that would combine and expand the existing conservation tillage and advanced technology pesticide and fertilizer application credit, which results in a reduction of about $1.3 million in general fund revenues. This is just a graphic representation of what we just covered. which gives you that you've got about 44.7 billion in general fund revenues. Moving to the next page, the chart gives you sort of a lay of the land of the year about what revenues have done with the various reforecasts. During the 2020 special session with the Chapter 56 budget, there was a reduction in anticipated general fund revenues of 2.7 billion. The governor's introduced budget adds back 1.2 billion in projected revenues. And that is about still 1.5 billion below where you were at the end of the 2020 session with the budget that you adopted. Turning to this next page, you can do, this is just a tabular format for what we just discussed. You can see where the Gaker forecast adjustments were made there in the middle of the page, the policy adjustments, which total about 43 million. And then with the revenue estimate, you've got a net change to general fund resources of in the middle between 1.2 and 1.3 billion. Turning to the next page, this gives you a look at how the appropriations break down and proposed spending. With the proposed spending in the introduced budget, the governor left an unappropriated balance of 51.1 million. That's the main point to take away from this slide. Just turning now to some changes to spending and savings. I'm just going to cover this at a very high level for you. This is sort of the top savings and spending items in the budget. The staff are going to cover by area this in much greater detail. But the net general fund spending net increase is about 1.5 billion of the biennium. You'll note that the table tabulates to slightly below that. This is because this is just the operating adjustments, and there's some slight general fund capital spending as well that Sarah will cover in her presentation at the end. There's an additional spending of 2.4 billion that's offset and about slightly under $1 billion in decreases. The major increases include things like a deposit to the Revenue Reserve Fund of 650 million. There's additional K-12 funding, which we'll refer to as no loss. You'll see also under savings, though, that there's a reduction there because that money gets added back in so that school divisions would remain whole compared to the budget you originally passed there. There's additional money for COVID-19 response, some bonuses related to state-supported locals and teachers. And then there's a number of restorations, including such things as the G3 program, financial aid, school counselors, pre-K, et cetera. And the biggest revised savings include changes to both the Medicaid and K-12 forecast. You might remember that there was enhanced federal Medicaid match, and that has since been extended, which Mike will cover. And then there's some debt service savings. Turning to the next slide, you'll see that with this proposed 650 million deposit to the Revenue Reserve Fund, total reserves would be roughly 1.9 billion, or about 8% of general fund revenue by the end of the biennium. This is on the low end of what other AAA states have and why it's so important. And you might remember the Secretary of Finance stressed that in his presentation back at the Joint Money Committee meeting in December. Moving to the next slide, this is our attempt to capture some early estimates of the direct funding that will come to Virginia under the federal coronavirus relief, this additional amount. There's also some direct appropriations that don't come through the state, including transit providers. There's an additional about 840 million there that will help WMATA. And then there's some additional direct appropriations that will be going to education. Tyler will cover some of that. I did just want to briefly mention in the introduced budget, there are changes to those CARES Act allocations from the previous coronavirus relief fund amounts. Here you can see that totals over 3 billion, but here you can see there's some additional allocations of about 163 million for a number of things. For instance, vaccinations, some testing, some additional small business assistance and PPE, et cetera. This next page just shows you where the some of the negatives, reductions, and what the administration is suggesting that is no longer needed. In the combined total, you can see the changes are about 85.5 million because you had not appropriated or allocated that whole amount. And Madam Chair, that completes my portion of the presentation, unless there are questions.
Are there questions for April?
Madam Chair, Adam here, Eben.
Senator Eben.
April, you've got $10 million savings for elections. That's assuming that there's no special precautions needed in the primaries or the general? Is that what that comes from?
Senator Eben, we would be happy to follow up on that, but yes, they removed that and then said that that was not needed. And Adam Rosatelli on our staff may also be able to add some additional insight on that as well. I don't know if he has.
Madam Chair, Senator Eben, yeah, I spoke with elect and they indicated at the time that they wouldn't need that money. Of course, that was at the time when they knew they would need to expend those funds by December 31st of last year. But that was communicated to me that they wouldn't be able to, or at least at the time wouldn't have needed that money.
Thank you.
Further questions for April? Okay, next.
Thank you. I'll turn it over to Charles.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you. In the Commerce and Trade Secretariat, the introduced budget proposes net increases totaling $69 million over the biennium. There's a net reduction in the first year of $3.4 million, followed by a 21% increase in the second year. If we could go to the next slide, please. Major general fund spending amendments include $40.7 million in increased support for the Housing Trust Fund, including additional funds to support mortgage and rental assistance. There's an additional $22.5 million for the Virginia Employment Commission, an additional $15.3 million for broadband, an increase of $9.8 million in economic development incentive payments, $5 million in additional funding for the Business Ready Sites program, $3.3 million to restore funding to the Eviction Prevention and Diversion Pilot Program, and $3 million for the Main Street Program at Department of Housing and Community Development. Next slide. So the next two slides just detail the amendments in Commerce and Trade. As I mentioned, the governor's budget recommends increasing deposits to the Housing Trust Fund by $15.7 million in the first year and $25 million in the second year. This would increase the appropriation to $70.7 million in FY21 and $55 million in FY22. Proposed funding in the first year includes $28.2 million, which is designated to continue the Virginia Rent and Mortgage Relief Program when monies allocated from the Coronavirus Relief Fund have expired. The budget also proposes an additional $15.3 million for the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, or broadband, and that includes $15 million in the second year to level fund grants at $49.7 million in both 21 and 22. Other amendments in housing and community development include $3.3 million, as I mentioned, which would restore previously unallotted funding for the Eviction Prevention Program, $3 million for the Main Street Program, and under this proposal, the program would provide additional technical assistance and grant funding to provide greater geographic and demographic inclusivity with an emphasis on outreach to minority and immigrant communities. There's also $600,000 the second year, which would restore previously unallotted funding for the Southeast Rural Community Assistance Project. And there are three amendments at the Virginia Employment Commission on this slide. The first is $10 million, which is one-time support to cover increased staffing costs associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. The next is $7.5 million the second year for estimated interest due on federal cash advances for unemployment insurance benefits. That comes due in September of 2021. Excuse me. The third amendment under the Virginia Employment Commission is $5 million for one-time costs to incorporate programs authorized by the CARES Act into the agency's new unemployment insurance system. Some of the other amendments include $1.5 million to fill 12 unfunded occupational safety and health compliance positions at the Department of Labor and Industry. Funding for these positions had been included in Chapter 1289, but was unallotted. There's also savings at the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy associated with the proposed agency restructuring. And there's just over $700,000 in the second year to establish a statewide unit to source SWAM participation on large dollar Commonwealth contracts. Next slide, please. There are four amendments in the Economic Development Incentive Payments Holding Account. The first provides $5.6 million to an incentive fund to be created by legislation that Madam Chair has introduced, Senate Bill 1156. The second is $2.3 million deposit to the Special Workforce Grant Fund, which was established as an incentive fund for Amazon Web Services back in 2018. There's also additional second-year funding proposed for the Virginia Jobs Investment Program grants. Madam Chair, with the exception of the Business Ready Sites program on this slide, which I mentioned earlier, the remaining amendments in Commerce and Trade are less than $750,000 or are technical. And I believe in the interest of time, it would be a good idea for me to stop here and see if there are any questions.
Okay. Are there any questions? Charles, I have a question. On the Unemployment Commission, part of the problem was indeed lack of personnel to handle the onslaught. But perhaps, at least in my opinion, a deeper problem was archaic, antiquated technology. Is there anything in the budget to upgrade that?
Madam Chair, to answer your question, there are two things. One, the funding for the personnel, let me address that first. So as I understand it, the BEC has contracted with third parties to be able to staff up and address some of the backlog of claims. And as I understand it, the anticipated funding from the Department of Labor would not be enough to cover that going into FY22, hence the general fund request. Your second question about IT infrastructure, the department was actually in the midst of a IT modernization initiative, which was sort of put on hold when the pandemic hit. And for example, the programs that were associated with the CARES Act, or 3 or 4 of them, were actually built into the legacy IT system because there wasn't enough funding for them to build it into the new, more modernized system. So there is an initiative underway, and the funding that's proposed will help the department move forward with that.
Okay, thank you. It would seem to me that this is an area where the federal government could really be of tremendous assistance, because virtually every state has outdated equipment.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Next.
Good morning, Madam Chair. Picking up with higher education on slide 20, this just shows in table form a summary of the proposed amendments, starting with the totals from Chapter 56 in the special session, and the net change in the first year of $142 million decrease and a net $32 million decrease in the second year. Then on the next slide on 21, the sub-bullets walk through a bit step by step, since there were 2 chapter budgets in 2020. And the first step is the technical distribution of the Chapter 56 budget reductions, which were held in central appropriations, now to the higher education agency budget. So that's where you see the reduction of $149 million in the first year and $146 million the second year. As you recall, Chapter 1289 of the regular session, after the reconvened session, had the majority of the new funding for higher education, about $284 million. And then Chapter 56 in the special session converted the unallotments to reductions within central appropriations, and also provided some limited restorations and some new FY21 one-time flexible funding for higher education, including about $60 million for various purposes, as well as the allocations referenced from the federal coronavirus relief fund under the CARES Act. And so the amendments before you essentially reflect additional restorations totaling about $111 million and new spending items of about $9.6 million. The next 3 slides summarize the proposed amendments in higher education in various areas. Slide 22 shows the proposed amendments that are related to financial aid, which are all restorations from items included in the 2020 regular session. The first is $36 million in the second year for the new Community College G3, Last Dollar Plus Workforce Initiative. And this provides the last dollar cost of tuition fees and textbooks for low and middle income students in certain high demand workforce pathways. And there is the corresponding budget language, and also there will be legislation this session on this new program. The next line restores the second year amounts by institution for undergraduate needs-based financial aid. The third is the restoration of the second year $7.9 million for tuition assistance grants for students at private universities to increase the grant award to about $4,000. And it does maintain the approved language regarding online students and also grandfathering current students in those programs. The last two lines restore the second year funding for new pilot programs regarding affordability at Norfolk State University and Virginia State University. These are both focused on students that live within 25 miles of the campuses and are authorized to ramp up to about 300 students at any one time over a 4-year period. On the next slide, 23, these are proposed amendments related to other restorations other than those ones related to financial aid. The first is $10 million for Massey Cancer Center at VCU. This one is actually split over the 2 years. Most of the restorations are done in the second year. The next two lines, $5 million each, fully restore the $22 million each over the biennium for George Mason University and Old Dominion University, having to do with enrollment growth over time. The next three, Norfolk State and VSU, are the remaining restorations from the 2020 actions other than financial aid. Third from the bottom is a partial restoration for Richard Bland relating to addressing some compliance findings, and two smaller items for Earth System Scholars Program and developing an early childhood bachelor's degree at Longwood. On the next slide, on 24, are other amendments. There are a handful of new spending items, the largest of which is $4.5 million for continuing the Connected Campus Initiative at Norfolk State University, which provides laptops and hotspots to students and faculty to address the digital divide. The next line is $3 million split between the 2 years for Jefferson Lab for a potential high performance data facility. The second year amount is unallotted until approved specifically by the governor. The third line increases the line item for UVA's Focused Ultrasound Center by $1 million. The next line is funding for new pre-hire immersion programs in construction fields at 2 community colleges. And then the final three lines are smaller dollar amounts at Richard Bland, VIMS, and New College Institute. Turning to the next slide, 25, are some other actions related to higher education that are either in central appropriations or in other agencies or our language. In the interest of time this morning, I will not go through these here. Just a few other notes for context related to higher education that are actually not shown on this page. As April mentioned, there were some adjustments to the allocations for CRF, including the specific inclusion of the funding for private universities, which was announced by the administration in November. And of course, there's new funding in the new stimulus package for higher education that the subcommittee will hear a little bit more about from Peter Blake tomorrow afternoon. And finally, as you may recall from the annual meeting, the administration has also proposed a restructuring of higher education 9C and 9D debt, which would provide some relief on payments over the next 24 months. And Madam Chair, that concludes this segment of the presentation, if there are any questions.
Are there questions?
Madam Chairman, Tommy.
Yes, Senator Norman.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. As I look at some of the restoration of funds and new spending, is any accountability being requested from the 4-year institutions that have had cost avoidance because students have not been on campus because of virtual learning, because of fees that were paid, but where there was really no service delivered. Is it any effort to get a update from the four-year universities on how much they did not have to spend as a result of the pandemic situation?
Thank you, Madam Chair, Senator Norman. First, we'll certainly alert Peter Blake to be prepared to speak to any new information on this tomorrow afternoon for the subcommittee. But secondly, just briefly, the OP6 group over the summer did receive some detailed preliminary and actual information from the institutions on their lost revenue, on their additional expenditures, and their offsetting savings in some cases from the fall, and have just recently received the next set of expectations regarding the spring. So I'd be happy to follow up in more detail on that. There's no specific language at this point, though, proposed in the budget itself regarding that topic.
Madam Chairman, another question, please.
Senator Norman.
Thank you. Sarah, I see the bullet includes funding for faculty and staff salaries, bonus of $1,500 and $750. Does that apply to administrators?
That is included with the total amount for all state employees under compensation. Adam Rosatelli may speak to it further as far as the specifics, but it would generally, I think, is the standard language that typically applies to faculty and administrators as well as staff. I'll double check the specific language.
Madam Chair, this is Adam. I'm sorry, Senator Norman. That's correct. That would include all of the administrators of those. Yes.
All right, Adam. The reason I ask that is just from the media, there seems to be a disparity in the approaches that some four-year college and universities have been dealing with administrators. Some have had a reduction either voluntarily or involuntarily in their overall comp. Others have declared outrageous bonuses during this period of time. And so the disparity has captured my attention, and that's the genesis of my question. Madam, if I could ask, I have two other quick questions, please, ma'am.
Yes.
Thank you.
Just to follow up on your previous one, I'll make sure that the subcommittee looks into this.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it.
And your next question.
It was on George Mason, and I'm not picking on them, but it did trigger a question in my mind that we're providing additional resources to ODU and George Mason on enrollment. Is this factoring in what the decline in enrollment has been for this academic year as a result of the pandemic situation and what is being projected in some of the out years based upon the declining universe of applicants?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, those $5 million restorations would complete the full restoration of the amount that was included in the 2020 regular session as of February. So the amount has not been adjusted based on information this year as far as enrollment. It's more related to enrollment over time. I'll also have tomorrow, if there's interest in the differences in the preliminary enrollment impacts by institution this fall. I can't cite off the top of my head what the numbers were for those two specifically right now without pulling that back up, but I'll have that tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. And Madam Chair, my last one is, and something I have been consistent about. Why are we continuing to put resources into Jefferson's lab? For years, the justification was that we were competing on that electronic beam accelerator, that we were in competition with New York, which was represented by the now majority leader Schumer. That decision has been made, and I'm just curious why we continue to put state resources into that.
On this one, I'll try to be brief and can follow up later with additional detail. That previous opportunity was awarded to Brookhaven in New York, although Virginia does have apparently a substantial role in that project going forward. As a result of that process is how the Department of Energy has begun to look at this potential new opportunity for Jefferson Lab with this high performance data center. So the funding that had previously been included for the other project, which was not awarded, was unallotted and reduced and is not there. This is new funding for this other new opportunity in a different area.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Yes. Any further questions for Sarah? Okay, then next.
Madam Chair, moving on to K-12 education, the proposed amendments to the direct aid budget result in a net reduction of $133 million general fund over the biennium, plus an increase of $51 million in lottery proceeds. The next slide, please. The net reduction in general fund reflects reductions from technical updates of $433 million. It reflects $705 million in new spending, including $18 million in restorations, and then it distributes the Chapter 56 reductions from central appropriations to direct aid, totaling $405 million. The next slide, please. The next slide just details the proposed amendments. On the first two lines, you see the technical adjustments and the routine updates. In the routine updates, the biggest routine update was the enrollment. Enrollment was down this fall, and that resulted in a $404 million savings from lower enrollment. There's 44,000 fewer students projected in the ADM in each year, and so that resulted in that decrease for enrollment. But then the governor is proposing $514 million in no loss payments to divisions to account for those enrollment changes and to hold them at harmless for that. There is $80 million provided for a 2% bonus to teachers in the second year. The governor proposes supplanting the COVID-19 relief funds, that's the gray machine revenues, with general fund dollars, $52.9 million. The governor is proposing $27 million to fund school counselors at the ratio that was adopted into code during the 2020 session. The governor is proposing $11 million to restore the VPI per pupil amount increase. This is the remaining Virginia Preschool Initiative funding from Chapter 1289 that was reduced. The governor is proposing $11 million to add presumptive English language learner in the ESL program. Because of the virtual instruction in this fall, schools were not able to test English language learner students to identify them, so there's a lower enrollment in that, and this would provide funding to assist with still educating those students who are in the schools. There's $2.7 million proposed to provide Accomack and Northampton counties the cost of competing adjustment, and then there are 3 restorations for supplemental education programs. Moving to the next slide. The next slide just details the increase in sales tax to K-12. Sales tax to K-12 is increasing $201 million over the biennium, resulting in $89 million increase to the division's distribution of sales tax. Because there was that increase in the first year of $42.3 million to divisions, that allowed the COVID-19 local relief payments to be reduced by the like amount, which then gets you to that $52.9 million that the governor wanted to supplant the gray machine revenues with general fund revenues. Moving to the next slide, I just wanted to detail the recent stimulus. The recent stimulus included almost 4 times the amount in the CARES Act for direct support to K-12 schools. Virginia is estimated to receive $939 million for K-12 schools, with 90% of that going directly to the divisions and up to 10% being reserved at the Department of Education. There's still some flexible funding for the governor, but the new funds require a majority of that flexible funding to assist non-public schools. And I note this because DOE would be responsible for administering the $47 million. Moving to the next slide, at the Department of Education, the largest proposed action is 1.9 for the repayment of a Treasury loan. And then there's some additional support for some positions, including the Deputy Superintendent of Early Childhood and some transition costs for the early childhood transition from DSS to DOE. And then very briefly at other education agencies on the next slide, you'll see the largest increase here, a proposed thing here is 10.8 million for the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts to plan for Monument Avenue's future, support for wage positions at the Museum of Fine Arts, and then some support for Frontiers Cultures, access to VITA networks, and then a restoration at the Library of Virginia for gubernatorial records. Madam Chair, with that, I will pause to take questions on K-12 and other education.
Thank you. Are there questions?
Madam Chairman, Tommy.
Yes, Senator Norman.
I noticed the additional appropriation for cost of competing for Accomack in Northampton County, which I had the privilege of representing for 10 years, and I have some familiarity with the situation there. What I am interested in, how are their cost of competing compared to some of the other struggling jurisdictions that we have, like Charles City County, some of the localities in Southwest Virginia?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, I have some of that information and comparing Northampton and Accomack to the Maryland counties as well, and I can follow up with you and the subcommittee on that information.
Madam Chairman, I'm not interested in Maryland. I'm interested in Virginia localities that I know traditionally have struggled with education funding. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? I think I heard Senator Newman.
Yes. Good morning, Madam Chair. The question is, one, I completely agree with what Tommy said. If we're going to do cost to compete to the point that you come down to Lynchburg and Roanoke, then we ought to just do away with it and put a greater amount in public education. This selectiveness is getting a little tough. But Madam Chairman, off the editorial, and that is, Madam Chairman, at the right time, I'd love to have a conversation, and maybe while we're in session, on exactly where are we all going with gray machines, because I seem like we're getting some mixed messages here. And I know His Excellency may have a view and we may have a view, but it would be very helpful, I think, overall for us to figure this out. And just one more editorial point is we in Lynchburg are seeing a number of parlors start up, long-term lease parlors start up. And as we all know, there's almost no regulation. This is in my opinion, a massive ripoff of the people of Virginia, because they do not have the regulation. They don't have the return of investment back to the gamers, if you will. And just a lot of deep concerns, Madam Chair. I know you have a lot of interest in it as well, but love to know exactly when that kind of fits in.
Okay. Just to reiterate what I've said consistently is that I will totally, absolutely oppose them remaining longer than the 1 year that was agreed to.
Madam Chairman.
I hope everybody else is of the same mind.
Madam Chairman.
Senator Norman.
As Madam Chairman knows, that she and I have been joined at the hip on this issue, and I have not equivocated one iota, and I can continue to express the extent of my disappointment that the governor co-opted even for a year.
Okay, anyone else on the education piece? Okay, next.
Madam Chair, turning to Health and Human Resources. So just in summary, and this is a little bit unusual in HHR, that it's actually over the biennium, the introduced budget is a net reduction of about almost 350 million general fund, or actually 374 million. Of that, almost 350 million is actual savings. And then there's 208 million in new spending as well over the 2 years. So like in other areas, there's about a $233.8 million reduction, which is related to, it's the movement of the agency reductions that back in chapter 56, where the unallotments were converted into reductions. It's just being moved to the HHR budget. As you recall, back in at the end of the session, 442 million of HHR spending was unallotted. And then in chapter 56 in the special session, about 208 million was restored. Moving to the next slide. So this table just kind of summarizes that overall information is the same. Like I said, it's the first year. Most of the savings is really related to the enhanced federal match that we're receiving from the federal stimulus. But you can just note here that it's about a 5.8% decrease in general funds for HHR for fiscal year 21, and then a slight increase of 0.5% in FY22. Moving to the next slide, please. On this side, this is, I'm not going to go over it line by line. These are additional restorations of those things that had originally been unallotted, but they weren't restored in the special session. I'll just highlight some of the top ones. Family First Prevention Services. If you remember, Family First is the new federal foster care law that allows states to draw down federal funds for foster care prevention, which of course has a state match. All of that funding had been previously unallotted. In the special session, you all restored about 8 million. This restores another 9 million of that funding. There's restorations for pharmacy costs at state psychiatric facilities. And this is also a little bit higher than the previous restoration because of additional costs. There's $3.5 million for the replacement of the agency licensing system of the Department of Social Services. And this is a system that will also be shared with the Department of Education. As you know, that in July, the Department of Education will take over the Child Care Development Block Grant, which is currently under Social Services. So they will share in that new system because adult licensing will still be handled by the Department of Social Services. And then discharge assistance planning. This is used in the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services to help discharge people from the state facilities. So that $2.5 million in the second year, that now fully restores. You all had restored 10 million in the second year for discharge assistance back in the special session. This now fully restores it. Next slide, please. Moving on to spending. So this actually summarizes all the COVID-19 spending in the Health and Human Resources area. It's a little over about almost 122 million. The vast majority of that is within, and most of this is within the Virginia Department of Health, is for the mass vaccination program, about 89 million. And the vast majority of this, a little over 70 million, is really to help fund within the local health districts and departments, kind of mass vaccination clinics when you get to the point where there's a broader population of people have to be vaccinated. So it kind of entails all the costs associated with running those things, temporary staffing, rental space, supplies, pretty much everything that you would kind of need to do to set up vaccination clinics. And then some of the other funding is for just auxiliary supplies, the warehousing of the vaccine, things of that nature. The good news is, which the administration did not have the benefit of this but since Congress in the most recent stimulus bill, they actually approved additional funding for states for vaccine administration. The preliminary estimate for Virginia is that we would get about 97 million for vaccination. So it is possible, and we'll be looking at this in the subcommittee, whether or not we could supplant most, if not all, of this 89 million with those federal funds. We just have to look at what the requirements are for those funds and what the final award is. The second line here is communication needs. This is basically kind of the public health campaign aspect of it. It's almost $20 million. So really this is to basically, most of it is to purchase, whether it's TV, radio, social media, pretty much through all the different mediums that you can communicate with the public. And it's not just it's not just on the vaccine, it's the continued campaign to encourage people to social distance, wear a mask and things of that nature until the emergency is over. And it is possible that maybe some of the, there may be some CARES Act funding that was still available, as well as maybe some of the new federal funding could potentially be used for some of this. So some of it could be supplanted as well. And the third line is COVID-19 surveillance for state facilities. So these are the state psychiatric hospitals. So this is within the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Services. It's about 6.4 million. This is mainly for testing and contact tracing for those facilities. And you probably already see the emails and and stuff from time to time that they oftentimes have to shut down admissions when they have outbreaks. So there's a lot that goes into that level of surveillance within state facilities. It is possible that the state also received more testing money in the federal stimulus bill, so maybe some of that could be used for this purpose too. The fourth one is strengthening public health disease surveillance, so 3.1 million. This would add about 24 positions throughout the state, additional epidemiologists in the local health districts. The intent is that with COVID-19 is that the capacity for the local health departments to really to do disease surveillance is somewhat limited. So this would kind of boost that capacity ongoing. You also see other things, data modeling. So through the Department of Emergency Management, the state has been paying the UVA Biocomplexity Institute for their, the UVA model and their work on that. And then the RAND Corporation, they're contracted with to help with the to review other models as well and to help provide analysis to inform the decision makers as to how to utilize that data. And the only other thing I'll note here too is there's also Medicaid coverage for the COVID-19 vaccine. Because of just the complexity of how the feds did the law, the traditional Medicaid population, we don't necessarily cover all preventative services. That includes even adult vaccines. We do in the Medicaid expansion population, so that's already covered. So this $1 million basically allows adults covered by traditional Medicaid to pay for the vaccine. Now this does not pay for vaccine costs; it just pays for the cost to administer the vaccine, because the vaccine the feds have been sure that is basically free to anyone. Moving to the next slide, please. So this just highlights some of the other major spending proposals. Like I said, I won't go through all of them. The Medicaid forecast. Now you will see when we get to savings, this kind of breaks out the Medicaid forecast into two pieces. The first year is savings, and you'll see that in a couple of slides. But the second year amount is a slight increase of about 17.9 million. So I just break that out to show you that when you look at the second year, there is a little bit of additional growth in Medicaid, but that's well within, as big as it is, that's really only a very minor increase. On the second line, you see updating the local health department match rates, 10.2 million. So the way that the local health departments work is they have a cooperative budget is what they call it. It's has a state share and a local share. So what this basically does is the match rates really haven't been updated to kind of reflect localities' ability to kind of contribute to it in probably 50 to 60 years. So really almost never since it kind of started. So their proposal is to kind of update that and to include a hold harmless so that no one loses money. But I think the most important thing to gauge from this is it doesn't really actually increase the level of funding for local health departments. It just basically changes who's paying the share. So the state would be paying an increasing share of some of the local health departments. So it doesn't really increase, it doesn't provide additional funding to do more services at local health departments. It's just shifting the payment mix between the state and the locals. Just some other things to note, the SNAP error repayment rate. So SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Still people commonly call it food stamps. We've been exceeding the error rate for the last few years, and we do have to, there are penalties from the feds to do that. So this sort of reflects those penalties and requirements to try to invest to get that error rate down. There's also an increase in the TANF unemployed parent forecast. So this is the two-parent TANF program. Most TANF payments are provided through just the federal funds, but two-parent families is a state-funded program. And that is the one part of the TANF program where we've seen an uptick due to higher unemployment that has affected two-parent families. And the traditional TANF population, which is more single-parent, the income levels are so low that we just haven't seen much of an increase there, as well as the fact too that they've received unemployment potentially or other types of assistance that have helped them as well. The only other one I noted here is the pilot program for, or two things, is dementia patients. This is a proposal within the Department of Behavioral Health. So there are a lot of individuals with dementia that end up because of behavioral issues in state psychiatric hospitals. However, that's not really the most appropriate place because dementia is a medical condition. It's not really a psychiatric. So this is a proposal of $3.5 million to kind of partner, maybe it's with assisted living facilities or nursing facilities to try to divert patients with dementia and keep them out of the state psychiatric hospitals. And the last thing I'll note is the last one the line here is 1.2 million. It's one of the service changes for Medicaid is they are proposing to cover doula services for pregnant women in Medicaid. Next slide, please. Here's all the other spending proposals. I won't go through it. Many of these are administrative in nature, but there are a few that are not. There are a couple of shifts related to residential psychiatric treatment facilities and Title IV foster care. I won't go into great detail here because it's somewhat complex, but it's basically shifting between basically the federal foster care program paying for it to basically Medicaid paying for it through the Children's Services Act. Probably the biggest implications of that are really that it will, because CSA does require a local match, it does shift some expenditures to local governments. So just to note that. The only other thing on here that's probably not really administrative in nature is near the bottom, another change in Medicaid, and it has a very small cost, is a change of policy to allow 12-month prescriptions for contraceptives. So this is the idea to try to continue to encourage appropriate family planning. That research shows that 12-month prescriptions for them reduces the number of missed prescriptions and thus, and promotes that family planning. Next slide, please. So this slide just summarizes the proposed savings actions. Again, I won't go into great detail about all. You can see the Medicaid forecast in the first year is $245 million in savings. So that is primarily over 200 million of that is related to enhanced federal match. So as you recall, back in March of 2020, when Congress passed the second federal stimulus bill, they included a 6.2% percentage point increase in the federal match rate for Medicaid. So that basically means that instead of a 50% federal match, they pay 56.2%. And they pay this for every quarter that we are under a federal health emergency. As April kind of mentioned, just last week, the federal health emergency was extended until April 21st. What this now means is that the fourth quarter of our fiscal year 21, we will now receive an enhanced match. The preliminary estimate so far is that's at least another 90 million that the committee will be able to look at. That granted it is one-time savings, can look at as, in their budget deliberations. On line 2, here the healthcare fund, it's about 59 million. Typically the healthcare fund, which is composed of tobacco taxes, pharmacy rebates, and Medicaid recoveries, it's dedicated to Medicaid and its state match. Essentially, there was a large cash balance that came forward from revenue generated there. That's where most of this money comes from, and there's some other adjustments to its revenues. The other programs here, the Children's Health Insurance Program, Children's Services Act forecast, and all of these programs are ones where you actually see, in some cases, the Children's Health Insurance Programs actually see some of the benefit of the enhanced federal match, but you also see there are some lower costs just because of less utilization of healthcare services during COVID-19. So that has had a slightly depressive effect on some of these costs. So moving to the next slide. And just kind of to conclude here in Health and Human Resources, there's always a variety of budget language in HHR. I won't go through this. This is just some of the highlights. There are things like authorizing the continued use of telehealth services in Medicaid after the pandemic. There's authority to increase the federal Medicaid reimbursement to some of the Veterans Care Centers. There's also clarification of inspection requirements, as well as expanding the use of some children's inpatient funding that we had provided to relieve pressure on the state children's hospital. To relieve that pressure, there's language that broadens that to allow them to use that not just for inpatient services, but also community-based services. That's just kind of some examples. But Madam Chair, if there are any questions, I can take them now.
Okay, are there questions? I guess you're in luck, Mike. It was very thorough. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, next is public safety and veterans.
Yes.
Caitlin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Moving on to public safety. The net general fund change in the introduced budget increases the general fund by 0.8% above the base for fiscal year 2021 and 1.9% above the base for fiscal year 2022. The largest increase is driven by the COVID response funding that is under VDEM, as well as equipment for the state police and inmate medical costs. The amendments also provide a treasury loan under the Alcoholic Beverage Control Authority for it to do a startup program for regulating the commercial marijuana industry. And the decreases you see included on the slide are driven by previously approved reductions from unallotments that were approved in Chapter 56. Next slide, please. Moving on to the Department of Emergency Management, as I indicated, the largest increase is for continued COVID response. Of this, 74% is for PPE, 19% is for supplemental funding for staffing to run the Emergency Operations Center continually, and 6% is for a health equity work group. Staff are working with VDEM to get additional information on this funding in the context of any new federal funding that was recently authorized. And the third row shows one proposed restoration for funding to upgrade the integrated flood warning system that was originally approved in Chapter 1289. And the rest of the amendments propose a total of 9 additional FTEs and a total of $3.2 million in general fund in the second year to increase and enhance VDEM's capabilities towards its non-COVID related responsibilities for other types of disasters, as well as some one-time equipment and finance and procurement positions to help the agency manage the large amounts of funding it receives. Next slide, please. For the Department of Corrections, the largest increase is $14.3 million that's proposed for necessary cost increases for inmate healthcare expenses. These are based on expected inflation rates and anticipated use of services. There's also funding on the second line for the 25% state share for 3 Board of Local and Regional Jail approved renovation projects at the Virginia Beach Jail, the Virginia Peninsula Jail, and the Montgomery County Jail. There is $1.3 million and 19 positions proposed for security staffing at 2 secure medical wards, and there is $1 million proposed for to provide general fund for the Drug Offender Assessment and Treatment Fund, which is usually supported by non-general fund court fees, but the revenue is down due to COVID-19 related to court closures and delays. And I also want to highlight it's a small amount, but the 5th line is a technical amendment to reflect a position that's being transferred from the Department of Juvenile Justice. Ownership of the Beaumont facility has been administratively transferred to DOC in the interim, and DOC uses that facility for training, and therefore this previously funded position is being proposed to be transferred to DOC that supports the building. And you'll see an offset when we get to DOC to reduce that funding, when we get to DJJ to reduce that funding there. There is also a small amount for a one-time bonus for the law enforcement officers at Lawrenceville Correctional Facility, which is the privately run facility. These officers were inadvertently left out of the calculations for the head counts for the bonus that was provided for correctional officers in Chapter 56. So this amendment just provides parity to those officers. Next slide, please. For the Department of Criminal Justice Services, the largest increase is a restoration of $1.5 million for competitive grants to localities to instill security measures to fight hate crimes. There is also a proposed total of $0.7 million for finance and IT positions to help the department manage its increased responsibilities and grant funds, including increased responsibilities it has from new laws that were passed in special session. And moving on to state police, the largest proposal is $9.5 million in the second year to increase existing funding the agency has for its routine vehicle replacement. The manufacturer of state police's vehicles has indicated that it no longer will be making sedans. So the department is transitioning to purchasing SUVs, which are more expensive. And the Public Safety Subcommittee will get more information on this from the agency tomorrow. And there's also $6.4 million total for phase 1 of state police's transition to the VITA environment. And there are 2 non-general fund amendments under state police to reflect revenue it's collected in those programs. Next slide, please. For the smaller public safety agencies, 0.6 million is being restored for forensic science from previous unallotments for laboratory equipment maintenance and IT positions. There's also funding for 1 new finance position. For the Department of Juvenile Justice, the amendments include 1.7 million for security renovations for the state juvenile correctional facility. And on the next line, you'll see the offset that I mentioned for the position that's being transferred to DOC. The amendments for the parole board would restore 0.4 million for a release planning coordinator and part-time investigators due to high caseloads of petitions, as well as additional proposals of 0.3 million for a victim services coordinator, additional parole examiners, and a one-time modifications of CORA system, which is DOC's system, but the parole board accesses it for information on its petitions. Oh, at the bottom of the slide, I also want to note there is reference to the non-general fund appropriation for ABC. The first bullet covers the cost of purchasing wholesale alcohol for retail. And there is also a proposal of 10.7 million for the authority to upgrade its human resources management system. And finally, I'll note again the Treasury loan under ABC for regulation of a potential commercial marijuana market. The bill does not provide a specified amount for that. However, JLARC has estimated the cost to be between 7 and 9 million per year. And again, JLARC is going to be presenting at the Public Safety and General Government subcommittees tomorrow. Next slide, please. For the Veterans and Defense Affairs, the net change was a reduction of 4.4 million in fiscal year 2021 and a net reduction of 0.7 million in fiscal year 2022. And next slide, please. So this slide just shows the details for the Secretariat. There is a proposed restoration for part of the Chapter 1289 funding that was unallotted. This would cover behavioral health peer support specialists, veterans outreach positions, and funding for an IT system upgrade. And for the Department of Military Affairs, there is a total of 250,000 proposed for personal protective equipment for the National Guard, funding to purchase a mobile command post, and funding for 1 workplace safety and health oversight position. And now I will pause for any questions.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Caitlin. Are there questions?
Madam Chair, this is Dave Marsden.
Senator Marsden.
Thank you, Madam Chair. April, my understanding is that there was money in the budget to build a new facility on the Bon Air campus. And of course, JLARC is doing a study now on DJJ. What is it anticipated that this is needed on a temporary or intermediate basis before the new facility is constructed?
Madam Chair, I'd ask Sarah to cover capital. I'm not prepared to answer that.
This is Sarah. Senator Marsden, can you repeat again? This is regarding DJJ, and what's your specific question?
Yeah, I had understood that there was money has been put into capital for a new facility on the Bon Air campus, and I assumed this one point I thought it was 7 million for security upgrades would be on a building that I was curious as to whether they still foresee using that building, and what the what are the repairs that are or the upgrades that are needed at this point in time.
Okay, there capital presentation is at the end, and there's not a new change in this budget. It was a previous language related to that project. Caitlin and I can follow up as far as what this operating action is and how that interplays with the plans and get back to you.
That's great. Thank you.
And Madam Chair, Senator Martin, I would just add, I think based on previous capital outlay amendments that it was very likely that these are needed in the interim. I think the language just allows that project to go forward, but staff will follow up with you on that.
Madam
Chairman.
Senator Evan.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. There was a reference made to bonuses for guards at the Lawrenceville Correctional Facility, which is contracted to a private corporation. And I just wanted to get some clarity. Is this something that's part of the contract, or would we be giving bonuses to private employees? How would that work?
Madam Chair, Senator Evan, this is associated partially with the one-time $500 bonus for law enforcement officers that was funded in Chapter 56. Those officers at Lawrenceville were inadvertently left out of the calculation. I guess it would be a policy decision for the committee if you would want to provide that bonus to the private employees. But the proposal is to provide parity with the amounts that are being provided to the other correctional officers in the state that was funded in Chapter 56 for a one-time $500 bonus.
These are, Madam Chair?
Yes.
Just to clarify, these are non-state employees that we would be giving a bonus to outside of their existing contract?
Madam Chair, Senator Evan, yes.
Thank you.
Are there further questions? Senator Barker.
Yes, Madam Chair. Question for Caitlin. I think it was listed as $14 million in additional healthcare expenses related to inmates in fiscal 22. My understanding has been that the actual number of inmates is going down. If the number of inmates is going down, why is the healthcare expenditures going up at the same time, projected to go up in fiscal 22?
Madam Chair, Senator Barker, this is driven primarily by inflation rates that are estimated for different drivers of healthcare costs, including healthcare services and pharmacy, and the usage rates that the department is projecting. I can follow up on more specific information for those cost drivers.
Thank you very much. That would be helpful to get that additional information. And actually, overall, the healthcare inflation rate is less now than what was anticipated. So this seems to be counterintuitive to have a $14 million increase when we have fewer inmates and when the overall healthcare inflation rate has gone down.
Madam Chairman.
Senator Norman.
A corollary question to what Senator Barker was just bringing up. I think my assumption is correct that there is still a backup in local jails of state responsible inmates. And my question, Caitlin, is this: is any of this healthcare money for inmates going to help the local jails that are currently housing the state inmates?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, I don't have that specific information on hand. I know that the local jails can bill DOC for medical costs for inmates that are state responsible in local jails. I will dig into the information for this particular amendment and provide you with an answer to that at another time.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Mm-hmm. Any further questions? Okay, let's go on to the next.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Picking up on slide 52 with agriculture and forestry, the introduced budget for agriculture and forestry provides a net decrease over the biennium of about $800,000. Next slide. As you can see, the bulk of the reductions were from the spreading out of the distribution of the reductions approved in the special session. With respect to both ag and forestry and natural resources, you'll find a lot of restorations in the second year with just negatives and placeholders in the first year. The spending in the second year is largely driven by a new Virginia Agriculture Food Assistance Program to be administered by the Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. There will be legislation to accompany this proposal, it complements an existing tax credit that is undersubscribed with a grant program for producers that are growing food to supply food bank programs, as well as to harvest crops instead of let them just go south in the field to get them to hungry families. Next slide, please. Turning to natural resources, the introduced budget for natural resources provides a net decrease over the biennium totaling $13 million. Again, this is largely driven by cuts that were spread from the adopted Chapter 56 and are not restored in the first year, but many restorations are present in the second year. If you go to the next slide, please. At the Department of Conservation and Recreation, at the Department of Environmental Quality, there are some new programs at DCR, such as an additional $1 million for the Natural Heritage Program. This is the program that manages our natural area preserves and deals with invasive species and things along those lines. There is $300,000 for increased personnel costs related to increased unemployment insurance costs by the department for wage workers in the first half of the year when the parks were closed. There is a proposal for $3.5 million for the restoration of Chickahominy tribal land. This is different than the proposal that you considered last year in a different parcel of land. I would note that with respect to this proposal, it appears that a conservation easement would be in place and that the land would be added to both the Chickahominies tribal footprint as well as the state's portfolio of managed and protected lands. There is $5 million proposed for the Project Harmony Living Shoreline to repatriate tombstones that were discovered on a private property and have them transported to and reinterred, I guess, in Maryland, as well as the construction of a Living Shoreline Memorial for the Project Harmony and the Columbian Harmony Cemetery here in Virginia. There's a restoration of $400,000 for the dam safety program. There is $13.6 million proposed for the Natural Resources Commitment Fund. I'll speak in detail about that in a slide or two. There is a restoration of $600,000 for state park operations. At DEQ, it is just a restoration of the cuts that were adopted in Chapter 56. And so that is staffing in both the air, land, and water protection programs. Next slide, please. At the Department of Historic Resources, there is about $500,000 for replacing the Robert E. Lee statue in Statuary Hall with one of Barbara John's. There's a restoration of funding for a cemetery preservationist position. At the Marine Resources Commission, 3 actions restore funding totaling about $100,000. That completes natural resources and ag and forestry. Actually, no, I have one more slide. Next slide, please. With respect to the Water Quality Improvement Fund for fiscal year 22, Chapter 56 provided $30.4 million for deposit to Water Quality Improvement Fund in fiscal year 22 from fiscal year 20 agency balances. So that money was adopted in Chapter 56, but its spending plan is proposed here in the introduced Senate Bill 1100. So in addition to that 30.4 million, Senate Bill 1100 has $13.5 million. Of that, 9 million would go into the Natural Resources Commitment Fund for agricultural best management practices, and $4.5 million would go to soil and water conservation districts for technical assistance. When all of the funding that's in the introduced is combined, you'll find a total combined deposit to the NRCF of $35 million in the second year, which would provide $24.5 million for agricultural best management practices in Chesapeake Bay region and $10.5 million for those programs outside of the Bay region. From the formula distributions, you may recall that Chapter 56 had language requesting a report and recommendation on new allocation language or a new allocation for Water Quality Improvement Fund. Because the budget was signed after the study was due, the language in the introduced sort of reflects that report. What you'll find is almost $4.5 million in new complementary funding for several new initiatives, such as the Department of Forestry's Trees for Clean Water program, $100,000 for VDH to identify septic system hotspots across the Commonwealth, new funding dedicated for outreach to small farmers, and then additional funding for things such as the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program and the Virginia Conservation Assistance Program. That completes natural resources. Nope, sorry. The language, there are several non-general fund amendments in capital outlay, which Sarah may touch on briefly, but the language is modified to allow for acquisition of inholding in contiguous properties at three parks, Highbridge Trail, Stanton River, and Grayson Highland, and it removes Westmoreland from the list of parks where parcels can be acquired. And with respect to natural resource or natural area preserves, it adds Dendron Swamp, Magathi Bay, and Lyndhurst Pines, and removes Antioch Pines and Camp Branch wetlands. There is language in DEQ that proposes the reimplementation of a 5% water quality exchange fee to be paid by the nutrient credit banks. You will recall that the General Assembly rejected this proposal during the 2020 special session. And there's language modifying the hydrofluorocarbon use language requirements to conform with federal regulations should new rules be adopted by the EPA. Next slide. If there are questions on natural resources or ag, I can take those now before I go into transportation.
Good. Does anybody have a question? Okay, Jason, you go on to transportation.
Yes, ma'am. Quickly turning to transportation, the introduced budget for transportation provides proposes an increase of $55 million general fund over the biennium and a net increase of $174.7 million in non-general funds for transportation programs. As a quick reminder, during the recession, during the pandemic, and in the special session and in Chapter 56, you did not reduce funding to transportation programs. And these are non-general fund estimates. So the impacts or the net impact of declining gas taxes being offset by sales tax with some enhanced federal funds, you're going to see that really reflected as that minus 281 for fiscal year 2021. Next slide, please. There are two major transportation initiatives included within the introduced budget. The first is a proposal for $50 million general fund to the Department of Rail and Public Transportation for expansion of existing intercity passenger rail service along the US 29 and I-81 corridors with eventual service and expansion to the New River Valley. What this will accomplish would be to provide additional daily service between Burke, Manassas, Culpeper, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, and Roanoke, with one train starting in DC and one train beginning the day in Roanoke, providing the opportunity for passengers to do daily round trip. Additional service expansion in New River Valley would be on the planning horizon. However, there are a lot of improvements that would be required west of Roanoke, and the total project costs are unknown at this point in time. In addition, at an emergency CTB meeting, after the release of the governor's proposed budget, the CTB, acting as a board, requested the evaluation of $50 million through the SMART scale to complement this program. So it's my understanding that the average rate for rail slots is in the neighborhood of $100 million, though that is a negotiation point that is going on. It appears that the $50 million proposal would cover approximately half of a slot. The second major transportation initiative is $5 million that is proposed for expanding multi-use paths across the Commonwealth. Certain long distance multi-use paths, things like the Capitol Trail or the Washington and Old Dominion Trail in Northern Virginia that you may be familiar with, would qualify for funding under this program, as well as a proposed new bike trail on the Eastern Shore that runs the spine of the Bay Coast Railway. The engineering estimate for completion of that project alone, I think, was somewhere north of $20 million. Next slide, please. Within transportation, there are several language amendments across multiple agencies that would provide additional flexibility to a number of agencies in response to the ongoing pandemic, including an authorization for a temporary needs-based increase of up to 20% in commercial airport entitlement funds for individual airport grants, requiring aviation to establish a waiver-based program and an application program for that. modifications to the new airline incentive fund language that was adopted last year to include airline retention. This was originally intended to recruit new airlines into the Commonwealth or new services to existing airports, retaining the Real ID staffing levels at DMV, and temporarily delaying local transit strategic planning requirements that are required under DRPT. There is also a request to authorize the transfer of a half-an-acre parcel of right-of-way adjacent to I-64 in Norfolk to the Norfolk Southern Corporation. And there is language modifying the $40 million bond finance capital improvement program at Portsmouth Marine Terminal to support the offshore wind industry to explicitly include buildings. That is the only change to that language, and it doesn't change the funding level. Next slide, please. That's everything that I have in transportation. I'm happy to take questions.
Are there questions for Jason on transportation?
Madam Chairman, Tommy.
Senator Norman.
Jason, going back to the $50 million request of appropriation of general funds on that rail, is the passenger demand there that would justify the 50 million plus unknown other costs that may be incurred, or is this more aspirational that if we build it, they will come?
Madam Chair, Senator Norman, the ridership on the existing Roanoke line actually is revenue positive to the Commonwealth. So that demonstrates that there is a ridership base there, unlike other other Amtrak lines except the Northeast Corridor that tend to lose money on operations. This Virginia specific funded line has been a revenue producer. So at initial reaction, the answer, sir, is yes. For the expansion, I am uncertain, but I don't have the fullness of information to do a cost benefit analysis, just given the wild uncertainty in what those improvements would be. Given the cost of the Long Bridge project, in the $1 billion range based on the bond authorization of last year, one would assume that that's probably the ballpark for these improvements. Again, the 50 is a starting number. The board has requested a complementary 50, that's 100. And then the engineering begins from there, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Yes, Senator Barker.
Yes, Jason, thank you very much, Madam Chair. Question on the Real ID situation is my understanding is that there's been a further postponement of the date at which that will be implemented, and is that the rationale for continuing the higher staff to deal with those people getting their Real ID licenses?
Madam Chair, Senator Barker, yes, sir, that is my understanding of it. These positions are funded by the surcharge of $10 that you have to pay on Real ID compliant credentials. I have not had a chance to explore with the department whether or not that fee is currently covering the cost of the operation, given the depressed demand and the decline or the depressed retail hours that DMV has been open. That is something I was intending to follow up during the course of the subcommittee work. But at the moment, it is my understanding that those positions are supported by the fee. Therefore, they are continued and the fee is continued as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right, thank you, Madam
Thanks,
Chair.
Jason. Next up is Adam.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So now moving quickly through general government. Next slide, please. Great. So beginning with a quick overview of judicial, where the proposed amendments for the judicial agencies result in a net general fund decrease of $3.7 million over the biennium. Next slide, please. So these are the proposed actions resulting in that net general fund decrease, which include a net zero transfer of funding and positions from the Supreme Court to the Court of Appeals to support the expansion of writs of actual innocence. Also in the Court of Appeals, $5.1 million over the biennium is proposed for 4 additional judgeships and 23 operational staff positions related to potential legislation in the coming session that would expand the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeals to include appeals of right for all criminal and civil cases. In the Virginia State Bar, there's $1.5 million proposed in the second year to restore previously unallotted and removed funding for the State Bar to hire additional housing attorneys. That would be 20 attorneys. Again, they're hired through the Legal Services Corporation of Virginia. And these increases were offset by $10.3 million in reductions, again, that reflect those movement of previously approved reductions in Chapter 56 from central appropriations to the agency budget. Next slide, please. All right, so quickly moving into executive offices, the proposed budget reflects an increase of $1.3 million over the biennium. Next slide. Looking at some of those actions, there's $200,000 proposed in the second year in the governor's office to provide contract support for 10 agencies to serve as a pilot group to develop and implement a plan to promote diversity and inclusion in state government. In the Office of the Attorney General, there's $800,000 proposed for 6 additional attorney and support staff positions related to that potential legislation expanding the jurisdiction of the Court of Appeals. Also in OAG, there's $268,000 and 2 attorney positions related to potential legislation in the next session, defining workplace and sexual harassment as a form of discrimination in the Virginia Human Rights Act. And finally, there's $25,000 proposed in the second year for operating costs associated with convening a LGBTQ advisory board to be considered through legislation in the 2021 session. Next slide, please. So moving into administration, the proposed actions result in a net general fund increase of about $1.2 million over the biennium. Next slide, please. So of those proposed amendments, $10.4 million, the second year reflects the restoration of prior allotments in the compensation board. And those include salary increases for regional jail officers and circuit court clerks, technology funding in the Technology Trust Fund, and additional staffing for sheriffs and Commonwealth attorneys. There are also 2 other proposed actions in the comp board. There's a proposal to add $1.5 million to refactor the Constitutional Officer Information Network, or COIN, application, which is being moved off the VITA mainframe system, as well as $332,000 the second year expected costs associated with the statewide increase in the minimum wage. In the Department of Human Resource Management, there's a net $700,000 proposed to upgrade the Commonwealth of Virginia Learning Center, and a net $400,000 to support the replacement of the Commonwealth's recruitment management system. In ELECT, there is $16.7 million proposed in the first year to replace the Virginia Election and Registration Information System. So this would support an existing $12.2 million they have, which is a mix of general fund and non-general fund HAVA funds that they've received, and then would align with budget language that is directing the agency, existing budget language directing the agency to replace the system by July 1 of 2022. And finally, there is a total of $28.4 million in agency reductions, again, reflecting the movement of central appropriations reductions to the agency budget. Next slide, please. So now a quick look at the proposed changes in finance. Those result in a net general fund increase of $400.3 million over the biennium. Next slide, please. So of the overall increase, $100 million in the first year is proposed for a one-time deposit to be made to the Virginia retirement system to reduce unfunded liabilities of the public school teacher retirement plan and the state employee retiree health insurance credit program. There's also a proposed $650 million voluntary deposit to the revenue reserve in the second year, which combined with existing balances in both the rainy day fund and revenue reserve would bring the total reserve balance to approximately 8% of general fund revenues. In tax, there's $235,000 proposed in the second year, and that's for the agency to comply with the 2020 language that established the Virginia Health Benefit Exchange to update their systems to accommodate that. The Treasury Board, there's a net $49.8 million in general fund debt service savings, mostly attributed to debt refundings. And finally, there's a net reduction of $300.2 million over the biennium. And again, that's the agency reductions being moved out. And next slide, please. Okay, so concluding my portion with central appropriations, the proposed amendments result in a net increase of about $1.5 billion. But again, that reflects all the movements of those centralized reductions that were moved out to the agency. So that reflects a kind of distorts that and shows a huge increase in central appropriations when that's netted out among all the agencies, net of the restorations that were proposed in those agencies. So next slide, please. Oh, I'm sorry, you got it. So taking a look at the proposed actions, there's 97.8 million the second year for a state and state-supported local employee bonus effective September 1st of 2021. If you recall, Chapter 56 included language directing the governor to include in his budget funding for the raise contingent, or bonus rather, contingent on FY21 year-end revenues exceeding the forecast. Again, that's $1,500 for state employees, $750 for adjunct faculty, and then a 1.5% bonus for state-supported local employees. There's $2.2 million in reductions attributed to benefit programs based on recent actuarial and enrollment data. 29.6 million related to the Commonwealth's IT applications, the majority of which, 27 million roughly, is VITA utilization estimates and proposed rate increases for FY22. There's 30 million proposed over the biennium for potential 2021 legislation. Of this amount, 25 million over the biennium is for the expungement of criminal records, including but not limited to the automatic expungement of misdemeanor marijuana convictions. And 5 million is related to criminal justice reform legislation that may have been passed in last session, the special session, and then 2021 session legislation that's not otherwise supported in the Appropriation Act. And then there is 11.8 million over the biennium, 9 million of which is for the slave trail, and 2.7 million is for inauguration and transition costs associated with the 2021 elections. And again, about 1.5 billion shows that increase reflecting the approved reductions being moved out to the agency budgets. So Madam Chair, that concludes my portion of the presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Are there questions for Adam? Okay, thank you, Adam.
Thank you, ma'am.
And next is capital outlay.
Good morning again. Capital outlay will wrap up presentation for this morning. Slide 76 summarizes proposed actions in capital outlay. First, for your reference, the table shows the first column to refresh your memory on what was included in Chapter 56, which ultimately did not include any general funds as those were unallotted, but a grand total of $3.3 billion for the capital program in 2021. And then the next column shows the additional proposed actions recommended this session. $18 million general funds, additional $135.5 million in tax-supported bonds, and the remainder in 9C, 9D, and non-general fund cash. The debt capacity advisory committee did meet in December and updated the annual debt numbers, and it did reduce from $765 million to $540 million per year for multiple reasons, including the adjustments to revenues, also accounting for lower interest rates, but notably because of the large size of the program in 2020 was likely the biggest reason. Some of the highlights for these new proposed actions are general funds to plan the replacement of the Supreme Court building and a major DGS state office building. And the capital outlay subcommittee will hear an update on that from DGS this Friday morning. The single largest item before you this session is proposed $58.5 million to increase the planned bed capacity for Central State Hospital by 48 beds to 300 beds. Many of the projects this time relate to infrastructure and life safety projects. There are 14 of those, as well as 4 related to equipment for new projects coming online. There are 2 9C and 2 9D projects at Virginia Tech and George Mason, and several non-general fund supported projects, which are detailed on a subsequent slide. And then there are language amendments, mostly adjusting existing projects for scope. On the next slide, slide 77, the 2021 capital construction pool totals just $11.7 million and includes several of those infrastructure and life safety projects. The others are standalone on the next slide. The one project beyond that, back on slide 77, is the project at Gunston Hall, looking at reconstructing the East Yard and Slave Quarter and also adjusting the current executive director's residence. Then on 78 are the other standalone infrastructure life safety projects. The largest is the campus-wide project at Virginia State University affecting multiple buildings, and that one alone is $34 million. Last slide on 79, there are several non-general fund cash supported projects, 7 agencies, including forestry, Department of Conservation and Recreation, corrections, DMV, veteran services, and military affairs. And those total a net $10.5 million. And that completes capital outlay.
Thanks, Sarah. Are there questions? Not seeing any. April, does that complete our agenda?
Madam Chair, that does complete the agenda for today.
Okay, great. I want to thank all of you for your presentations, and thank you committee members and the public for joining us. We are going to be having several meetings today and tomorrow because it's a short session and we have so much work to do. So this afternoon at 2 o'clock, the Joint Subcommittee on Local Government Fiscal Stress will be meeting. Members of the committee, if you are not on that subcommittee but would like to attend, please let staff know and they'll give you the access numbers. I also want to announce that we have several virtual subcommittees starting tomorrow at 11 o'clock with the Health and Human Resources Subcommittee. Tomorrow at 1:30, there's going to be a joint meeting of Public Safety and General Government. And at 3:30, the Higher Education Subcommittee will meet. So we have a pretty busy 2 days here. And if there is no further business to come before the committee, we will adjourn.